Throughout the centuries, many things have been used as weapons. Insects have been found to be incredibly effective. Follow me down the rabbit hole about weaponized insects. Hello, friends, and welcome back to the rabbit hole. I'm your host, Danny, and today we are talking about weaponized insects. This might be a two-parter. I'm not exactly sure. Just depends like how long it takes me to get through all of my notes. So, if it's two parts, cool. If not, cool. Here we go. And also different parts of this episode have been suggested as like individual episodes, but they all actually fit into this one episode. So when we get to those parts, I will thank the people that have requested those parts of the episode. Anyway, let's get into the history of weaponized insects. This actually was really, really interesting. I had no idea. So first of all, why should we use insects? Well, they can infect enemies by delivering deadly pathogens, and they can destroy agriculture, which will cause like widespread sickness and hunger. So makes sense to use insects. At the end of the 2nd century, Romans were hit with the first insect weapon. So scorpions were known in the region for their painful stings and their venom, which makes sense because it would cause irregular breathing, slowed pulse, convulsions, and sometimes even death. In fact, the Persian kings would regularly order scorpion hunts and offer bounties to assure safe passage for caravans on the Silk Road. So they had like scorpion hunters, and you would get paid a decent amount for hunting scorpions. But with the Romans at the walls of Hatra, just about to take control of Mesopotamia, scorpion bombs rained down upon them. How cool. I mean, okay, it probably wasn't cool for them, but like what a cool like idea. Sorry, I don't know why this like really was really interesting for me. So this actually caused a lot of issues like with the Romans where skin was exposed. So their legs, their arms, their faces, and their eyes were attacked. And this attack actually held the Romans at bay for 20 days before the troops finally broke off the battle and retreated. So throughout European history, we see beehives and wasps' nests being used as weapons. In the 14th century, we saw an increase of catapulting beehives and wasps' nests into enemy troops and over enemy walls. Of course, this would piss off the bees or the wasps, so they would attack whoever they were being catapulted at. Although I would not want to be the person whose job it was to gather the wasp or bee nest or beehive and put it into the catapult, because I'm sure that person also got stung a lot. So either way, sounds like not a good time. In the 19th century, I think emir of Bukhara, which is basically like their king, which in Bukhara is present day Uzbekistan. So you know where we're at. He would use bugs to do his bidding, or a lot of his bidding. So he had this 21-foot deep hole that was covered with an iron gate, and it was only accessible by rope. And he would throw victims into the hole and torture them with bugs. And today we refer to the hole as the bug pit. He had all kinds of different bugs down there, but one of the bugs that were in the pit were the assassin bugs. And these bugs they're about an inch long, and they're carnivores. So they typically eat other insects, but when they're starving, they will feed on people. And I have a feeling that they were probably starving down there. So their bite feels like a stab with a hot needle, and then they inject this digestive enzyme into their victim to liquefy tissues. And this would leave like festering sores in human flesh. This sounds awful. He also had sheep ticks in the pit, which are like the cousin to the assassin bugs. And they're nothing nice either. So you have all these different bugs, right? And I would assume a couple other bugs, but bugs that the assassin bugs wouldn't want to eat. And one of the emir's jailers actually described how 2 British prisoners were slowly eaten alive. He said, quote, masses of their flesh had been gnawed off their bones, end quote. And in that case, the emir was merciful and beheaded the prisoners to end their suffering after they had been eaten by bugs for who knows how long. He was like, let's just take their heads off. But if that's him being merciful, that means that he's leaving some prisoners in that bug pit to just be eaten by bugs alive for who knows how long. I don't know how long it takes an assassin bug to eat somebody alive. Anyway, in World War II, we saw the Japanese drop plague-infected fleas and cholera-coated flies on Chinese cities. I don't know. That was like really hard to say. So this actually caused 440,000 people to die. So many people died from these infected fleas and flies. And they planned on dropping plague-carrying fleas over San Diego as well, but that never happened. Probably because we bombed them before they could bomb us. And the Germans were conducting research into different types of mosquitoes for their lifespan. They wanted to establish if they could keep them alive long enough to transport them from the breeding lab to the drop point to infect enemy troops with malaria. And they found that they could. They found which mosquito types were like the best ones to do it. Even though they never actually dropped the malaria-infected mosquitoes, they completed the research, which I think in the future we will get into at the very, very end of this. I think that comes back to play in present day. In Vietnam, there was actually the Viet Cong used quite a bit of wasps and hornets. So they had these underground tunnels that they would use to plan attacks, and they would sometimes throw a wasp or hornet nest into U.S. defenses before they would launch an attack. So they would like go through their tunnels, pop up, throw a wasp nest, and then like watch the U.S. troops freak out because they're being attacked by wasps. And then the Viet Cong would attack while they're panicking about these bugs, which, again, very smart. I don't think I would have ever thought of that, but also how terrifying. They would also use scorpions. So if someone didn't see like a tripwire, and they would set it off. So when our troops, the U.S. troops, were going through these tunnels, they would sometimes set off a tripwire, and then scorpions would rain down on them from a hidden cavity in the roof of a tunnel that they were exploring. And the Viet Cong would also use these Asian giant honeybees for attacks. And these bees have been called, quote, the most ferocious stinging insect on Earth, end quote. So they're nothing nice, that's for sure. So the Viet Cong soldiers would carefully relocate colonies to the trails that the American forces were known to use. And then they would attach this small explosive to the honeybee hive, basically. Then they would wait, and they would like watch as the U.S. troops were passing by. They would set off the explosive, and that would obviously piss off the insects, and they would attack the soldiers. Let's just hope that you did not have a bee or wasp allergy if you were a soldier in Vietnam, because that sounds awful. I mean, the Viet Cong used all kinds of crazy tactics. What a crazy war. But these are just some of the ways that they used insects for their attacks. So obviously in World War II, the Nazis were working on weaponizing insects, right? And it's no surprise that there were many Nazi scientists brought to America to continue their work after the war. In fact, a lot of these Nazi scientists got their sentences basically completely expunged because they would come to either the US or the Soviet Union to continue their work. One of those scientists was Erich Traub. He was, at first he was working for the Soviet Union, and then eventually he came to the US. But let's go back. Let's learn about his history first before we get into all that. So he was born in June of 1906 and was a German veterinarian scientist and virologist. In the 1930s, he studied at the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research in New Jersey. And while there, he did research on vaccines and viruses to include pseudorabies and LCM, which is a rodent-borne disease. When he returned to Germany in 1938, he worked as a scientist for the Nazi Party until 1942. And then from 1942 to 1948, he worked as the lab chief at the Reich Research Institute for Virus Diseases on Animals on Reams Island. So Reams Island was a German animal virus research institute. During the war, they conducted some biological warfare experiments there. Traub specialized in viral and bacterial diseases, specifically working on weaponizing foot and mouth disease. And it is reported that this work was dispersed by aircraft onto cattle and reindeer in Russia. But he specifically was working with like ticks, fleas, and mosquitoes. Like how to use these bugs to distribute foot and mouth disease. So again, after he worked for the Nazis, he worked for the Soviets. He didn't have a choice. He was forced to work for the Soviets. But in 1949, he was brought to the U.S. under the government program Operation Paperclip. And this operation was meant to exploit scientific knowledge that the Germans had, but also to deny the Soviets the knowledge. Because basically, as soon as the war ended, we went to the Cold War with the Soviets. So we didn't want them to have the information, and we wanted it. And when Traub came here, he went to Plum Island. Plum Island was basically like America's Reams Island, right? So this is an island off the coast of Long Island, and it's about 3 miles long, a mile wide at its widest point, and it is the home to Plum Island Animal Disease Center, which was established by the USDA in 1954. I understand that there is a year or like a time discrepancy between when Traub actually came to the U.S. and when this island was established, or when the disease center was established on the island. So he actually worked at Fort Detrick for the Army biological weapons. He also worked for the Navy biological weapons before he went to Plum Island. So dude was like everywhere doing everything with everybody. And I think that he didn't really care because he just wanted to like continue his work. And he did. And his family was with him, so it was fine. So the point of the Animal Disease Center on Plum Island was to conduct research on animal pathogens to protect farmers, ranchers, and the national food supply. And this is the only place where they are allowed to conduct research on live animals, even now. So, but because of the nature of this research and how damning it could be on the food supply, access to the island was invitation only. It was incredibly restricted. So when Traub was first sent there, when it first opened, he actually became known as the father of Plum Island. And this is due to his extensive background in foot and mouth disease, because they specialized in foot and mouth disease there as well. So, but outside of foot and mouth disease, they also studied the African swine fever. Both foot and mouth disease and African swine fever can be incredibly dangerous for our food supply. In fact, if any imported meat has foot and mouth disease, they ban all meat from that country because of how contagious foot and mouth disease is. They actually also studied the avian flu on Plum Island. I mean, I'm sure they studied other viruses that affected the food supply. These are some of the biggest ones that they were studying at the time. But there were also rumors that they were conducting experiments on animals and humans on Plum Island. Like, weird experiments. Strange animals had washed up on Manhattan and Montauk Islands. So, like, I don't know. They were called, like, the Manhattan Monster, the Montauk Monster. These weird, like, hybrid type, weird-looking animals that weren't normal-looking animals. But, of course, this was all swept under the rug, and they deny, right? So, I don't know. There's just some rumors that some weird things were happening on Plum Island. And it was the 1950s. They get away with a lot more. But during the 1950s, Plum Island was used to research anti-animal biological warfare, and they were specifically focused on weaponizing foot and mouth disease against enemy livestock, which we know that Traub, who had specialized in biting and stinging insects, had helped the Germans do to the Russians. So during their research and all this biological warfare research, ticks were considered the ideal candidate for biological warfare because they were small, which makes them hard to detect. They're resilient, which makes them really hard to kill, and they feed on blood, so they'll bite animals and humans. We're going to get back into all that in just a second. I'm just going to continue down Plum Island. We kind of jump around in this episode. I typically don't do this. I typically go in a pretty consistent order. This episode, we do kind of need to jump around just because I need to explain the history, and then we kind of go back and be like, but this is why that history was important. So hang with me here. Plum Island bragged about how secure it was, right? Like they were like invitation only, restriction, blah, blah, blah. But in 1978, foot and mouth disease got out and every animal on the island had to be cremated. Although apparently the scientists didn't cremate all the animals, they ate some of them, which I don't know if I would do that, especially if I was the one doing the research into these diseases, knowing that these animals have these diseases. Even though you're cooking it, like, I'm not going to trust this meat. Disgusting.
Did you know that over 40% of Americans have a hard time swallowing pills? So when it's time to take your vitamins, large capsules and pills are out of the question. We know that gummy vitamins exist, but they're full of sugar, they get stuck in your teeth, and they only contain a fraction of the nutrients you need. Luckily, Easy Melts has discovered the ultimate vitamin sweet spot. Vitamins that melt in your mouth, taste like a treat, and are packed with nutrients ready for absorption, all without an ounce of sugar. For a limited time, Easy Melts is giving listeners a free 3-month supply of vitamin D3 with their first purchase. To claim your free D3 vitamins, visit try.easymelts.com/spring24. That's melts.com/spring24. Say goodbye to the old way of taking your vitamins and say hello to the easy way. Menopausal and perimenopausal women, listen up. It's time to take control of your health and comfort, and Winona is here to help. Winona is a telemedicine company for menopause care who believes that your symptoms are real, important, and deserve to be taken seriously. And for many women, this starts with hormone replacement therapy. Winona's HRT is made with plant-based, bioidentical hormones rather than synthetic ones, so it better aligns with your body to offer relief from hot flashes, weight gain, and other uncomfortable symptoms. 80% of women who use Winona find relief within just 90 days. So, what are you waiting for? Get started today. Visit buywinona.com today to start your free visit. With free shipping and the ability to pause or cancel at any time, your path to wellness has zero obligations. Use code SPRING24 at buywinona.com for 25% off your first treatment plan. That's BYWINONA.com for 25% off. Winona. Menopause care made easy.
But after that outbreak, the USDA did an inspection of the facility because obviously something weird is going on, and they wrote a report that was 190 pages long. Like, there was some messed up things going on. Plum Island was so mismanaged. They basically found the facility to be in complete shambles. They had leaking roofs and walls. They had steel beams that were just completely rusted through. They had an incinerator laying in a ditch that was half filled with dirty water, just like laying there. And soon after the USDA inspection, they had this crazy outbreak of Rift Valley fever, or RVF. And RVF presents like the flu, but if it's not treated, it will kill you. They had been experimenting on how to weaponize RVF by like infecting mosquitoes with it. And so some of these mosquitoes got out and bit the scientists, which is why there was an outbreak. Luckily, they knew how to treat it, so nobody died. And they were also very fortunate that these mosquitoes did not make it off the island. Could you imagine if they had made it off the island? They're mosquitoes. How do you find them all? Anyway, they were very fortunate that this outbreak was minimal to just some scientists and they could treat it pretty quickly. But that's not all, because they still haven't gotten their shit together on this island. The FBI did an investigation on them in 2002 because they had I don't remember how many, like 76 or something employees go on strike. So then they brought in other employees to replace these striking employees. And what was found was that there's chemicals everywhere, everything's being mishandled, things are just like thrown about. So that encouraged the FBI to do this investigation. But like the chemicals weren't. I don't want to say it's like the least of their worries because it wasn't. But they also like found out during this investigation, I guess, or at some point that a couple of the workers took a minivan from the island. They left with it, and they never came back. Well, eventually the van was found completely empty. They never found the workers or whatever they took with them from the island. And they have also had 2 more foot and mouth outbreaks on the island. So that makes 3 since they started in 50 years that's not bad. But also, your whole job is to not have outbreaks of this. So they would have to kill all the animals. Every time they have an outbreak, they have to kill all the animals on the island. Because if this gets out, it will affect our entire food supply. It's so contagious and it spreads so rapidly. Like, they can't take any chances. But Plum Island isn't the only place that isn't following inspection guidelines. In 2007, a report revealed that 113 bioweapon facilities across the U.S. are refusing to comply with inspection guidelines. And they don't have to, because the Bush administration completely just like gave them anonymity. They don't have to comply with them, even though they're supposed to. And this isn't just against federal laws. This is against the Geneva Convention. And now, don't get me started on the CDC and all their leaks, because you think these smaller and bioweapon facilities aren't following the guidelines. Well, the CDC employs 10,000 people or something like that, and they have every dangerous disease known to man. Anyway, we're not getting into the CDC. That would be an entire episode on its own, because they are not practicing safe measures. But now we're going to kind of jump into conspiracies here. So we're going to jump all the way back to 1971, when a mysterious illness was devastating Cuba's pig population. So within 2 years, over 500,000 pigs had died or been slaughtered. And pigs are a huge food source in Cuba. The cause of this illness was the African swine fever, which conveniently is being studied at Plum Island. Oddly enough, this was the first and actually the only outbreak of African swine fever in the Western Hemisphere. Up until that point, we had not seen it here. It's African swine fever. They see it in Africa for sure. We don't see it here. So how did it get to Cuba? And as a result of this outbreak, Cuba was forced to kill every single pig on the island, because this is just such a contagious illness that spreads so quickly, kind of like foot and mouth disease, that they had to kill all their pigs. So, of course, the Cubans quickly blamed the CIA for the outbreak, which, makes sense, because in the 1960s, Operation Mongoose was ongoing, and the primary mission was to remove Fidel Castro from power. And this operation was well known to the Cubans, so they just decided, the CIA must be behind this. Biological weapons actually were authorized for the operation, although they say they were never used. I'm not sure, but it has been reported that they never used biological weapons. They actually planned to spray botulinum toxin on the island, which is one of the most potent toxins on Earth. And they said they were going to do this because it would save the lives of American soldiers, but they didn't take into consideration the Cuban civilians that would die from it. I don't know. But they apparently never sprayed this toxin over Cuba. But Operation Mongoose ended before biological warfare could be implemented, apparently. But because of all the history there, as soon as this illness broke out in their pigs, Cuba pointed straight at the CIA, and they're like, yeah, the Americans are doing this. The Americans are behind this. In 1977, 2 Cuban exiles actually admitted that they were a part of this. So they said that in 1971, they were given a virus in Panama, and then they traveled to the Navassa Island, which is near Cuba, and smuggled the virus to Cuba. The only place in the Western Hemisphere at the time that had the African swine flu was Plum Island. And they planned to transmit it through ticks. So the thought here is that these Cuban exiles were given ticks to go and give. I mean, you can infect one pig. Now you have an outbreak on your hands, right? So you got Plum Island being the only place in the Western Hemisphere that has access to this flu, and then all of a sudden, Cuba has to kill all their pigs because of this African swine flu, or swine fever, excuse me. I don't know, seems a little coincidental to me. Anyway, we're moving on. In 1975, Old Lyme, Connecticut experienced an outbreak of a mysterious disease. I feel like we just talked about this, but in Cuba. So it started with a man that was working security, and he was walking around a building as that he was working at, and this included tall grass. So he was just walking around doing his rounds, whatever he needed to do. So that night he noticed a small welt on his ankle, but he basically just chalked it up to he had new boots. He was breaking them in. It was fine, right? But the next morning, the hurt had grown into a painful blister that basically looked like a bullseye, and he noticed that there was this bug in the middle. A tick, to be exact. There's a tick right in the middle of this bullseye-looking wound. A few days later, his joints were hurting, and he felt sick, and he thought he caught the flu, basically. People throughout the area started showing all kinds of weird signs. So some people got rashes, some people got fevers, there were swollen joints, headaches, dizziness, shortness of breath. Some people experienced delusions, and some people even became paralyzed. So obviously, something weird is going on. At first, the doctors just diagnosed it as arthritis, probably because of the joint pain, although I don't know if everyone experienced joint pain. Must have been one of the biggest symptoms. And they named it Lyme arthritis because Old Lyme is where they first had this outbreak. Before I continue, it is very important to know that Old Lyme, Connecticut is right across the water from Plum Island, where they do tick research. Just saying. I'm just putting that out there. Let's continue. So it would take them 2 years to connect Lyme arthritis to the bite of a deer tick. And this is when they found a type of single cell bacteria called Borrelia. And it was the cause of the disease. So it would go on to be named Lyme disease instead of Lyme arthritis, which is now why you have Lyme disease and why people say you can get it from ticks, because those things are connected. As cases kept coming in, they basically started to map it out. And what they found was Plum Island was basically ground zero for this new illness. Everything, this Lyme disease, it started in Old Lyme, but it was, and Plum Island is obviously in the water, but all the mainland areas all around it were heavily infected with Lyme disease, and it slowly spread outwards from there. So you're yep, that's where it came from. There's no denying that. But here's the question that we need to ask is, was this an accident that they accidentally released a couple ticks, or a couple ticks accidentally got out and that caused this Lyme disease? Or was this the government conducting tests on its own citizens? And I know you guys appreciate where my brain is going, but some people are oh, the government would never do that. That's a fucking lie. The government would do that because they have done it. There's plenty of evidence saying that the government has conducted experiments on their own citizens. Let's talk about the Tuskegee experiment for a second. So this is where they tested syphilis on black males. We did touch on this a little bit in the AIDS episode, but if you haven't heard that, I'll go over it a little bit. So if you haven't heard about this, they infected 400 black men with syphilis just to see how it would affect them. They weren't told they had syphilis. They didn't treat them for their syphilis. And a lot of the patients, because they didn't know they had syphilis, transferred it to their partners. And people die from syphilis. These black men were dying from syphilis. So that's an example. They also have infected prisoners with cow blood just to see what it would do. They have exposed people to plutonium just to see what it would do. They have given prisoners LSD to see if they could control their minds. MK Ultra. They had Operation Sea Spray, which was an experiment where they dropped a bacteria over San Francisco just to see how it would impact them and if they could infect a city with this bacteria by just like dropping it from an airplane. Yep, they did that. They released bacteria into a subway system in New York City. And these are just like some of the ones that we know about. There's several more that we do know about as well. I didn't name all of them, but we don't know about every single experiment the government has tested on us as their citizens. I mean, we could get into the COVID thing if you really want to, but I'm not going to. I'm putting it out there. You take your own conspiratorial mind and go with it where you want with that one. But, of course, the government has denied that Lyme disease was artificially created and released to the public, but it does sound like them trying to just kind of like cover their asses, you know? Especially when you learn about Willy Bergdorfer. What a fun last name. So he was born June 27th, 1925 in Basel, Switzerland. He has a PhD in zoology, parasitology, and bacteriology. Yeah. For his thesis in college or university, he chose to study the single-cell bacteria in ticks and evaluate the efficiency in transmitting diseases to animal hosts. That sounds a little like Lyme disease, but we'll continue. In fact, most of his research was around the interactions between animal and human diseases and their transmitting vectors, so specifically ticks, fleas, and mosquitoes. Early in his career, he developed biological weapons for the U.S. military, which sounds an awful lot like Eric Traub, and he specialized in weaponizing ticks. Bergdorfer became famous for his discovery of a tick-borne bacteria called that caused Lyme disease. So, and they named it after him, of course, because when you're a scientist or a doctor, you do something really cool, or they do this in gymnastics too. You do something really cool, or you find something really cool, you get it named after you. So earlier I told you that this single-cell bacteria was called Borrelia, but it's more specifically called Borrelia burgdorferi. Wow, that was really hard to say. And I think that's super convenient because earlier in his research, when I was talking about his thesis and he was studying single-cell bacteria and ticks, he was studying a type of Borrelia. It was not his type, obviously. It was a different type. But it's just really convenient that that's what his thesis was about, and that most of his research in his life has been about weaponizing ticks and the study of different types of Borrelia. It's also very convenient that it seems like Lyme disease was created, and then this specific type of Borrelia, the single-cell bacteria, is the cause of Lyme disease, and he just happened to discover it. There's no other Borrelia like this before. Now, all of a sudden, it seems very likely that this disease was man-made and potentially released. And then this man who studied these cells his entire life, these bacteria his entire life, was the one that discovered it. It's just too convenient. There's just too much coincidences here. So anyway, we're going to jump back to conspiracies. Like I said, we're kind of jumping all over the place here just because that's just how the research went. So between 1966 and 1969, about 300,000 research ticks got out. So they didn't just get out. They were actually released into the wild. Convenient, it was right before Lyme disease was prevalent. Anyway, they were supposed to be traceable. Basically, there were supposed to be these traceable ticks, and they were going to see what they were doing, basically. One of the species released was the Lone Star tick. This tick is known for being very aggressive. Most ticks will wait. They'll attach themselves to a piece of grass, wait for an animal or a human to brush up against them, and then they will attach themselves to the prey, right? Lone Star ticks actively hunt, and they're actually the only ticks with eyes. So they can detect when we're breathing out, we're expelling air. They follow that and they will aggressively attack you. Unlike other ticks, they can bite multiple times, and even like they're young, so they're newborn babies can hunt and bite. These ticks are wild. So they can go for months without food, even though they actively hunt. Like these are ways that they can just stay alive. So they can go for months without food. They can drink water from the air, so they don't need a water source. They can survive underwater, and they can be frozen and then come back to life. So they are incredibly resilient. Like ticks are already pretty resilient, but specifically Lone Star ticks are it's rough. Not only that, but this species can swarm. So they will get into a ball of like 10,000 ticks, and when an animal or a human brushes up against them, you'll get thousands of tick bites because you have all these ticks that are biting you all at the same time. And this all makes these ticks really dangerous, right? And they can carry so many diseases, one of which being alpha-gal, which we're about to get into. But these Lone Star ticks used to only be in the southeast part of the US. But in the late 60s, thousands were released in Virginia because they're just like releasing ticks left and right, I guess. I don't know. But since then, they have expanded to the entire eastern half of the US, and they continue to expand. Like they're not done yet. And this brings us to alpha-gal syndrome. So this part of the show was requested. So thank you, Mom, for the request. I appreciate it. She suggested that maybe alpha-gal syndrome isn't everything that they have told us it is. And so I started going down that rabbit hole and realized just how deep this goes. And that brought us to all the weaponized insects. So thanks. So alpha-gal syndrome, or AGS, is a type of basically like a food allergy. It basically makes people allergic to red meat and some other products made by mammals. So in the US, it typically starts with a Lone Star tick bite, and it will cause mild to severe allergic reactions to beef, pork, or lamb, and can also cause reactions to dairy products and gelatins, because gelatins are made from animal products. According to Mayo Clinic, there's no treatment other than just like avoiding the red meats and the products that are causing you to be sick. And some of the symptoms that would associate with alpha-gal syndrome includes hives, itching or itchy scaly skin, swelling of the lips, face, tongue, and throat or other body parts, wheezing or shortness of breath, stomach pain, diarrhea, upset stomach, or vomiting. And a lot of people just like don't get diagnosed with alpha-gal syndrome right off the bat. Like they will have it for years and years and have like all these weird symptoms, and then they don't really get like a diagnosis. So they don't really know what's wrong with them, because a lot of our healthcare professionals don't know about alpha-gal syndrome. But recently, alpha-gal cases have spiked like a lot. So 110,000 cases have been identified since 2010. However, it's estimated that it's closer to like 500,000 cases that exist because they're not getting diagnosed with it. So people will have this issue and they don't even know about it. There are a couple laboratories in the nation that test specific, like for alpha-gal specific blood markers. And so one of these labs estimated that in 2017, they had about 13,371 suspected cases. But in 2021, they had 18,885 cases. So that's like a 41% increase in 4 years. And of course, not every case goes to the lab. Not every person who has AGS is being tested. A lot of people don't even know to test for it. So yes, that's a 41% spike of people that are being tested. So the theory that is on the rise here is that alpha-gal syndrome was potentially lab made because it will cause more people to eat lab-grown meat. Right? Like it all makes sense now, because in the lab they can grow gal-safe pigs, which I talked about in a current events episode, I think. These are pigs that are developed without alpha-gal, so anyone that has alpha-gal syndrome can eat them. Alpha-gal, I don't think I explained this. Alpha-gal is like a sugar that is found in the red meat, which is what people are being are allergic to, is the sugar that's found in the red meat. So you can grow these pigs without the alpha-gal sugar in their meat, and then anybody that has alpha-gal can eat them. Revivicor is one of the first companies to get the FDA's approval to produce this alpha gal safe meat. And they are looking into sending meat products that are alpha gal or gal safe to those experiencing AGS. So they're literally contemplating right now. They got the FDA approval in 2018. Now they're trying to basically be like a meat delivery service where they're sending meat to people's homes. Because why not? Money, right? Here's the thing. Everywhere I look, they keep saying that there will be another pandemic, and everyone believes that it will be caused by lab-grown meat. And so many people are jumping on this lab-grown meat like bandwagon. You have Walmart that's trying to sell exclusively lab-grown meat. I don't think they are yet, but that's like their goal. You have all these people that are like, oh, it's better for the environment. People that are pushing it, like Bill Gates, because it's better for the environment, apparently. But if you give a bunch of people a disease where they can't eat meat, then you create something in a lab that they can have. Now you can add anything you want to these meat products. It's lab grown. How would we know what's in these meat products? As it is, we don't know like what vaccines, what weird things they're giving to the cows and the pigs, like food wise, to potentially create issues in us. But now in a lab grown situation, they can put anything in there. They can genetically modify anything they want into this meat. And why would they want another pandemic? Well, because they can take more of our freedoms away. They can tax us more. They can make more money. They did so much in the pandemic, and we just let them. So, of course, they would want another one. But speaking about Bill Gates, we're going to move on to the Gates-funded mosquito program. So this part of the episode was requested by someone, but I could not find for the life of me who actually requested it. So if it was you that requested it, thank you so much. It goes right along with this episode. A couple of you might have requested it, I don't know, but something weird is going on with the Gates Foundation. Recently, not too recently, Microsoft billionaire Bill Gates funded the world's largest mosquito factory in Colombia. So the goal of the project, of the mosquito project, is to, quote, protect the global community from mosquito-borne diseases such as dengue, Zika, yellow fever, and chikungunya. I know I'm saying that wrong. It's a disease. I don't know. I've never heard of it before. But it's obviously prevalent enough that they want to protect people from mosquito-borne illnesses, and this is one of them. They're releasing thousands of mosquitoes in about 11 countries, to include Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, and Australia. That's outside of the U.S. So inside the U.S., they have this sister program. It's from a company called Oxitec. Oxitec is releasing genetically modified mosquitoes. So the Colombia factory, they're just like breeding mosquitoes and changing their genes that way. Oxitec is actually genetically modifying mosquitoes. Apparently, they're trying to release male mosquitoes that have this self-limiting gene, and when these males mate with virus-carrying females, the offspring will have the self-limiting gene. They have already released mosquitoes in the Florida Keys, but have been approved by the EPA and the Biden administration to release 2.5 billion genetically modified mosquitoes in California and 1.5 billion in Florida. That's a lot. That's a lot of mosquitoes. So the thing is, gene modification is experimental. We don't know if this will work or cause worse issues in the mosquito population. We do know one thing, is that we'll have more mosquito bites overall because there are just like more mosquitoes in the world, and they're definitely going to be biting us. Whether they have a virus or not, that's what mosquitoes do. Oxitec actually has a long history of failed experiments, even though like they've tried to cover it up. And I mean, Gates has a lot of money, so they can easily cover things up. But they have a long history of failed experiments. So this being very experimental doesn't sit right with me. And as we know, Gates is a huge vaccine advocate and an advocate for lab-grown meats. So maybe he has his hand in the alpha-gal issue. I don't know. But with his interest in modified insects and everything we just learned about weaponizing insects, I'm wondering what he thinks he will eventually be able to do with these mosquitoes. Will he try to infect them with alpha-gal syndrome to push more lab-grown meats? Or is he behind the ticks? Will he somehow try to put a vaccine in them so when they bite us, now we're vaccinated from whatever? I don't know. He could do so many things with genetically modified mosquitoes if this experiment works. We have actually recently had 5 cases of malaria, which we have not seen in 20 years, malaria in the US. We had 4 cases in Florida and 1 case in Texas. And officially, the Gates Foundation and Oxitec are not responsible for this malaria spread. However, they say that the Gates Foundation is trying to combat malaria, but to test if you have successfully modified the genes of the mosquito, they need a virus-carrying mosquito to try to mate with it. See where I'm going with this? They have to have malaria-infected mosquitoes to test their hypothesis. There's just no way. So it just seems really weird. You're gathering billions of mosquitoes. Billions. You're telling me a couple malaria-infected mosquitoes didn't accidentally get into your billions and then be released and infect people? But of course, the Gates Foundation, the Gates family, they have so much money, they have so much power, they can control the narrative, so it doesn't really matter what we think, because at the end of the day, the media is going to say, well, the Gates Foundation, Oxitec, wasn't behind it. It was a coincidence. I don't know. I'm starting not to believe in coincidences. And then, okay, last conspiracy I'm going to share with you, because I thought about this one while I was recording. So they studied the avian flu at Plum Island. Plum Island is still up and active, by the way. Is that how the avian flu outbreak over the last couple of years happened? Because they were trying to get rid of a bunch of birds. It's weird that it just popped up out of nowhere, and then all of a sudden we had this egg shortage, we had this meat shortage, we had all these issues. I don't know. This was just something I thought about, so I wrote it down in my notes really fast so that way I could share it with you guys, because it seems very convenient that they're studying the avian flu, and then all of a sudden we have to kill a bunch of birds. I'm back to wondering if this is a lab-grown meat conspiracy. Because everywhere I look, lab-grown meat's going to be the next pandemic. Everyone wants lab-grown meat, which freaks me out, honestly. But they can control our food source more. If you can control the food source, you can control people. Because you can put, relaxers in there. I don't know, you can make people foggy. You can mess up people so bad with food. Because we have to have it. It really freaks me out, honestly. But that's it. That's what I have for Weaponized Insects, guys. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Until next week, my friends, stay skeptical, and I will see you all then. Hey, friends. The Rabbit Hole is an independent podcast with everything you hear done by me, Danny Mercy. I appreciate all of your support. Please rate and review wherever you're listening. If you want to follow us on Instagram, it's at rabbit.holepodcast. And thank you, Zakar Balaha, for our awesome intro.